Welcome to the Liberal Europe podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Silvestre, and thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And for this conversation, I bring you Sam Goodman. Sam is the Senior Policy Director at the China Strategic Risks Institute, that is based in London, and also the co-founder of the New Diplomacy Project, a think tank that informs the Labour Party in Britain's foreign policy. We talk about the extended effects of the Iran war and the Strait of Hormuz situation, about EU-China relation, and in particular, relationship between China, Germany, and France. And after our main conversation, please stay to hear a little more about the path that Sam took before I got him on the podcast, and also to know more about the work done at the China Strategic Risks Institute. But now, with no further ado, I bring you Sam Goodman. I'm here with Sam Goodman. Sam, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Sam, let's dive right into it. We have many things to talk about, but one of them, naturally, it's very topical at the moment that we record this, which is the Iran situation and the Middle East turmoil. So tell us a bit from your experience, what could be the impact? What can be the direction of EU-China relations regarding particularly economic security?
Yeah, I think, it's worth pointing out that, while we're recording this podcast, there's been news overnight that the fighting might be continuing in the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians have also launched a number of drones at the UAE that have been shot down. So right now, this ceasefire is very tenuous at best. And Europe is being affected by this directly. There are reports that we are going to have air fuel rationed this summer. It's going to really impact on European holidaymakers. But that will also then be followed by a steep increase of inflation in the fall. That's going to be huge increases in energy prices, huge increases in food prices. And for many Europeans, I think, we've been here before. We were here with COVID-19 and the pandemic. We were here with Russia, Ukraine. And this is the third big shock we've had geopolitically that's had real ramifications for the cost of living of ordinary European citizens across the EU. And I think, that is the context we have to frame this in, first of all. The second point of the context is, of course, that EU-China relations are pretty frosty at the moment, and they have been for some time. And part of the reason for that frostiness is this huge trade imbalance between the EU and China, where essentially China today is importing a lot less than from the EU. It's exporting a huge amount because its manufacturing output is essentially producing an overcapacity where it has to export to grow. And many of these products are being dumped in Europe. They're subsidized products. They're companies that receive huge subsidies from the Chinese state. And it's gotten to a point where that's no longer sustainable for European policymakers. And that's really caused, I think, some of the unease in the relationship as a starting point. What does it mean for China more broadly? China, a lot of analysts would say, is they're in a pretty strong position compared to other countries because they stockpile energy. They also have some level of domestic production of energy, both oil and gas, and of course, green energy. So China could be viewed as a solution to some of these problems. However, within the first couple of days of the conflict breaking out in the Middle East, the first thing China did was restrict its energy exports so that it could maintain domestic supply. So for the immediate part of it, the Chinese are not actually being that helpful. And you look at what's happening in Asia right now, about 1 billion people are having energy rationing. And the Chinese are not necessarily stepping up to help them. So that is a really important point, I think, first of all. What is the role China is playing to mitigate the worst effects of this conflict? Not to forget as well that, Beijing is a staunch supporter of the regime in Tehran. And actually, without Beijing's support, it's very hard to see how Tehran would be able to fight on, both materially, having the arms and the infrastructure to do so, also politically. And of course, Europeans are aware of this. We've seen this dynamic play out in Ukraine, where again, the NATO head has said that China is the chief enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. So this isn't new. So that is the other factor, I think, for China that's worth putting in for context. I think it's led to an interesting discussion in Europe on 2 points. One, this question of de-risking and national resilience. And I think we've been having it for a while. It was very clear in the Draghi report, a lot of recommendations about how the EU could build up its resilience from these shocks. This talk now of Buy European, which is in the EU Industrial Accelerator Act. I'm sure we'll discuss that a bit more And also then this question about green energy and green technology. And, actually, does Europe now need to be following the example of China and increasing its solar, increasing its wind, getting more people to drive electric vehicles? And is this the way actually to protect Europe in the future from any conflicts in the Middle East? And so a lot of people are thinking maybe China could be the trading partner that essentially allows European countries to import this technology, because China dominates the EV supply chain now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They also dominate the solar supply chain. I think something between 92 and 93% of polysilicon that goes into these solar panels comes from China. So you can't really install solar panels in any meaningful scale without the Chinese. So that also, I think, is a big question as well. Economically, China's economy has been suffering for a while. It has higher youth unemployment. Its housing sector is still very much in a recession. So this conflict isn't good for China either. And so I think some of the narratives about this being a good thing for China being able to take advantage of it, maybe, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And I also think it's obviously very complicated for the EU at a time where it's trying to build up its own national resilience. It's trying to de-risk some of its supply chains away from China, and we'll get into that. But at the same time, there are people within the EU, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, for example, who is saying, actually, we should be trading more with China because China has this green technology that means that we can be less reliant on oil and gas from the Middle East.
But Sam, let me interrupt you here and have a follow-up, because this is something that I have been thinking about, but you're the right person to ask. Can we, in a way, interpret this moment as also a crossroads for China? Because I imagine for China, they can still play this game that you're just describing a second ago, or they can get ambitious and try to replace the US in the world stage as now the superpower, diplomatically, politically, economically, who knows, even at the military level. Or do you think that they will maintain mostly this position that they have, which is very centric, letting things happen, and then we'll see. We'll have our own strategy. It's a millennial strategy. Do you think that temptation can be there, or do you think that the system, it's too hard to move in that direction?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is very much this sort of pull and push dynamic that's at the heart of the politics within the Politburo in Beijing. Mm-hmm. There are some, and some people speculate that Xi Jinping, who is, the chairman of the Communist Party, obviously the West talks about him as a president, but he's not elected, who has essentially made himself a ruler for life. Mm-hmm. There's some people that prescribe the view that he essentially wants to be more ambitious, and particularly ambitious about reunifying or essentially taking military action against Taiwan. But you're right. I mean, I think there is an opportunity that China could step in the void here and deepen its relationships with partners that have been affected economically by what's going on in the Middle East. And China has over the years. I think China is now the number one trading partner of the vast majority of countries in the world, particularly in the global south. But again, there is a natural caution within the Chinese Communist Party. I think you're correct in what you say. They think of politics in centuries, while we think about it in weeks and years. And there are many in the Politburo who'd say, actually, we're not in a rush. Let the Americans do what they want. If they implode, they implode. We don't need to get involved with that. I would also, as I said in my previous answer, the Chinese also have to think about their own economic position. It's not just a tick next to China that they're going to do very well out of this conflict. There are huge risks for them. There are some in Beijing who perceive there being a concerted strategy by the USA to get rid of their closest allies, right? And we saw this with the capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, that now you have a friendly regime in Venezuela towards the US and US interests. Some people put what's happening with Iran in the same category, and that makes people in Beijing very nervous because these are some of their closest partners. These are useful proxies as well. If they want to keep the Americans pinned down in other regions of the world militarily, they need proxies that do this. It does make Beijing a bit more vulnerable if the US are clearing the table strategically so they can spend more time focusing on the Indo-Pacific. So to your question, I mean, I think it's difficult to tell, being sat in Brussels and in Lisbon and London, what Xi Jinping is personally thinking about all of this.
Yes.
I think we can probably, with some certainty say that it's a mixture of both a level of caution and also some who around him who will be saying we should be doing more to take advantage of the situation.
Because I imagine that they are aware of this need, particularly from the European Union, but mostly from the Western in the Western world, which is this need for stability. Either it's market stability, political stability, diplomatic stability, and with all the craziness that we see from the Trump administration, naturally people will start turning more into China, even if there's resistance on that, naturally so. You just mentioned a couple of them. It's not truly a democratic system. It's not a system that accounts for freedom of the press. As you mentioned, there's a Taiwan situation, there's a Hong Kong situation. But, markets like stability and like to know that their partners, they will not, change the world order just because they want to. So that is something that we will keep following. I don't know if you want to jump in here or we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stability point is really interesting, and I do think sometimes it's kind of a misnomer when you're thinking about the PRC as well, because there are many actions that PRC has taken in the last several years that are the opposite of creating stability. And you alluded to it, one with Hong Kong, which is obviously the only global financial center in Asia. And some of what it's done in Hong Kong is very disruptive to the flow of free trade and capital. The jailing of the pro-democracy lawmakers, but also the dismantling of a free press that you would need to run a financial center of that scale. But of course, there are other things geopolitically China is doing right now that is disruptive and actually doesn't help a stable order. Whether that's some of what's going on in the South China Sea with the Philippines and other countries where there are huge questions about territory. Of course, the question of Taiwan. This would be ruinous for Europe if China were to take some sort of action against Taiwan. A huge amount of global trade goes through the Taiwan Strait. TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company, produces about 93% of advanced semiconductor chips that we need for AI and for all future technology. So there are huge risks at play if Xi Jinping were to go on this military adventure.
Mm-hmm.
So we do need to be cautious when we're thinking about the idea that China could be some sort of stable pole, particularly, as you say, when you have an autocratic government in power in China that thinks very much about ideology and prioritizing narrow ideological aims, which is essentially keeping the party in power, versus, economic stability.
Something that maybe can create some thought in Beijing, it's the visit of European leaders like Chancellor Merz, also President Macron. Naturally, or it looks like there's a little bit of alignment between these capitals and Beijing, but it's also the Brussels aspect of it. Tell us a little bit how this chess is being played right now, Sam.
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll break it down and start with President Macron and the position of the French here. President Macron has been a regular visitor in Beijing for many years. I think he tries to go at least once a year bilaterally. But of course, the French position has been for some time that China needs to rebalance its trade with Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, after the last visit that President Macron went on in December 2025, he wrote a piece in the Financial Times where he publicly called out the trade imbalances between Europe and China, which he pointed out had reached $1 trillion, and said that they urgently needed to be rebalanced, and that if they weren't rebalanced, France would advocate the EU taking more protectionist measures, which means more tariffs on Chinese goods. And then what followed is you had a report from an internal French government think tank that said that their position should be that they put 30% tariffs on all Chinese goods. So this was quite, I guess, quite provocative in some ways, in some circles. And of course, it's worth noting that the French position on electric vehicle tariffs, they were the ones who advocated for tariffs on Chinese EVs. They were then singled out by Beijing and countermeasures on the French brandy industry. So the French are very forward-leaning on the idea of prioritizing economic security and protectionism and trying to rebalance the relationship. But at the same time, they have many trade agreements with China. They partner with the Chinese, for instance, still in space, which some people struggle to believe. They sell a lot of high-end luxury goods in China, but they also partner on civil nuclear and other areas, sell a lot of Airbus planes. So the French are trying to essentially trade more with China while also prioritizing the economic security of Europe. They kind of have a cakeist approach. If you believe in cakeism, they want it all. Turning to the EU and the EU Commission, it has been a difficult relationship, particularly with this set of commissioners who do care very deeply about economic security, who do take the view that one of the big problems of the day is the fact that China is enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And you think about the exchange between High Representative Kallas and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi last year when they met. And you had this omission from Wang Yi that Kallas really drew out of him, where he said that China can't afford for Russia to lose the war in Ukraine, which was quite astonishing to read in the paper. But it's something that we'd all kind of known. And the Chinese were kind of furious about this leak. And it certainly didn't help the relationship. But of course, the other issue is that the Commission has been driving this economic security agenda. If you look at the raft of EU legislation we've seen in recent years, the CHIPS Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, they've all originated in the Commission and the Commission President's office, and then been put to the member states to, in many cases, water down. Now, last year was the 50th anniversary of EU-China relations, and there was an expectation that Xi Jinping might come to Brussels. It's what the Commission wanted. It's what a lot of EU member states wanted. And it would have been perfect timing, because the timing of that anniversary was when the first round of US tariffs landed. And many in Europe were talking about getting closer with China in response. But Xi Jinping was not interested in traveling to Brussels or to Europe, and instead has welcomed a steady flow of European leaders the other way, coming to see him in Beijing. Mm-hmm. And in the end, you had a couple of EU officials going to Beijing for the anniversary, including former EU Commissioner Michel Barnier, who gave quite a telling speech on economic security, because he said that it was also in China's interest to address these trade imbalances, because it wasn't just an economic problem between the EU and China. If these trade imbalances continued and overcapacity continued, he said eventually what you would have is you would have populism spread across Europe, and you would have more populist governments who would then close off trade with China, and it would become self-defeating in its very nature. And that message was delivered quite clearly. I don't know if it was heard, but it was delivered quite clearly. And then the other issue that you've had with the EU Commission is you have this new EU Cyber Security Act as well. And this is kind of the recent news, which is that the EU has said that they're banning inverters, Chinese-made inverters that go in solar panels and wind turbines from the EU, and that they're pulling funding from Chinese companies that might receive some EU funding for this. So there was a story a couple of days ago that the EU had blocked funding to Chinese telecoms company Huawei, and that they wouldn't allow funding for their inverters. And so this has, again, created some difficulty in the relationship. The other sticking point is this EU Industrial Accelerator Act that the Commission, along with the French, it is believed, are proposing this idea that we should have provisions that favour European products, sort of buy European products, to help European industry and ensuring EU supply chains. And the Chinese have come out very aggressively against it. They've said that if the EU Industrial Accelerator goes ahead, that they will implement countermeasures, which is interesting because, this is an industrial policy. This focuses on the EU. But China is seeing it not as a domestic industrial policy for Europe. It's seeing it as a trade measure that requires a counter-trade measure. And of course, the irony is not lost on me, and I'm sure it won't be lost on you, that these are the industrial policies that China has already adopted, that we are really talking about something that is reciprocity. For a European company to enter into China's market, they have to do so on China's terms. And we've seen that with the European auto industry, who, when they came into China in the early 2000s, they had to set up joint ventures with Chinese companies that were majority owned by the Chinese company. They were forced to transfer technology to the Chinese company to the benefit there to localize their supply chains in China. And now China has some of the best automotives in the world, and that's not a coincidence. And so for Europe to propose similar terms to China, and then for the Chinese to react in this way, it is deeply ironic. But going to the third sort of player in all of this, Germany, right? And they have had a new Chancellor Merz, for about, I believe, over a year and a half, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. He went to China for his first visit about, I think it was about a month and a half ago or 6 weeks. I have to check on that. And this was a big moment because Germany really is at the epicenter of the economic difficulties that the EU is facing with China. Germany accounts for about 2/3 of European investment into China. It's German companies, your Volkswagens, your chemical companies. But Germany's really been facing huge deindustrialization as China is dumping its manufacturing goods in Europe and has this huge overcapacity issue, to the point where Rhodium believes that they're losing about 10,000 manufacturing jobs a month, which is significant. And Chancellor Merz doesn't really know how to deal with it. I think what has changed is that you've seen a change in language about the German government. If you look at the traffic light coalition under Olaf Scholz, they were very reluctant to talk about trade issues with China, particularly negative trade issues. And what you've seen with this government is more willingness to be frank about it. But then you and I could argue that the reason why they're being frank about it is that the figures no longer make it possible for them not to be. So there was a big question before he went to Beijing about how he would bring up this issue, that China essentially is forcibly deindustrializing German manufacturing, and that this is a big problem for Germany and by extension a big problem for Europe, because obviously many of these German companies have supply chains across Europe. And he did mention it, but he also took with a trade delegation. And he did curiously mention the idea that there should be some sort of a free trade agreement between Europe and China that might solve some of these problems. And so, for Germany being really at the economic forefront of this stuff, and they've dubbed this sort of China Shock 2.0, it is interesting to see that these mixed views coming out of Berlin at the moment. And still this inability to be able to act. And it really, the big question is where Germany will fall on this, because if Berlin decides to take a stronger position on economic security, suddenly you may have alignment with Paris and with the Commission in Brussels. And as history has shown, when these three partners work together, you shape a coherent EU-wide policy. And so I think that's something to watch. And we could be sat here by the end of the year and we could be in a completely different world where actually the EU has a coherent policy on China for the first time in a long time. And economic security is at the heart of it.
And with ramifications into all other member states like Hungary, like Portugal, like Slovakia. And that is, Sam, something that I will bring you back on the podcast to talk about it. But now, as we have a couple more minutes of your time, tell us then a little more about the work that China Strategic Risk Institute does, and then where can people follow you guys and follow you online?
Sure. I mean, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. We've got a website, but essentially, our work sort of is divided in three. So we look at questions of economic security with a focus on the green technology supply chain. So myself, I've written a lot about electric vehicles over the last 2 years. We look at the People's Liberation Army's grey zone tactics against Taiwan. And that includes looking at this question of the disruption of undersea cables. Many of your listeners will be aware of the sabotage of undersea cables here in Europe and how this is very similar to what's taking place in the Taiwan Strait. We're starting to see a bit of coordination between Russia and China on this front, and this is an area that we're very interested in as an institute. We also look at the expanding legal architecture that China is putting in place, these extraterritorial laws, as you were, that are applying to citizens and businesses all over the world, from the national security law to this anti-secessionist law, and the impact that they are having on European businesses as well. And so those are sort of the three buckets that we focus on. But we are based in the UK, but we work heavily in Europe. I'm regularly there in many European capitals. And I actually have a report launch in Brussels looking at the strategic leverage that Europe has in regard to China. So really trying to get into the weeds of some of these supply chains. Where are the parts of China's economy that still rely on European companies? And is this an area where Europe should be leveraging these dependencies to get more balance in the relationship?
I'm going to put all the links on the podcast show notes, not only for the work that Sam's been doing, also the institute, and then you're going to give me some of your literature so that I also can add for people to know a little more. I've been talking with Sam Goodman. He's the Senior Policy Director at China Strategic Risk Institute. Sam, this was very illuminating, and it was a delight to have you on the podcast. And please come back soon.
I would love to. Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. What was the path chosen to the point that I have you now on the podcast?
Sure. So I'm the Senior Policy Director at the China Strategic Risks Institute. Before I worked for CSRI, I worked for a human rights NGO that focused on Hong Kong. Prior to that, I spent about a decade working in British politics, including working for the Labour Party for 3 years. And I suppose I could probably give you two anecdotes that sort of summarise how I've ended up working for a China-specific think tank in the UK that looks at China through the lens of risk. I mean, the first of which is I was 23 and I was working in the UK Parliament for a member of Parliament who worked for our Foreign Affairs Committee. And they had an inquiry into the 30th anniversary of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which, for your listeners, if they don't know, this is the treaty that the UK signed with China that handed back Hong Kong in 1997 on the basis that China would uphold the rule of law, it would still allow democracy, freedom of the press in Hong Kong. And even then, China was encroaching on this deal and didn't really want to uphold it. And so there was an inquiry in the Foreign Affairs Committee about this big anniversary, which my boss at the time took part in. And the great and the good and anyone who'd been involved in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong came and testified. Everyone from Chris Patten, the former UK governor in Hong Kong, the last British governor, Anson Chan, Martin Lee, all of these figures. But at the same time, on the streets of Hong Kong, you were having mass protests and what's become now known as the umbrella movement, because Beijing had decided to publish a white paper that said that they would not honour their previous agreement to allow direct elections for the Hong Kong chief executive. And my experience sat in a tiny office in Westminster was quite instructive to me, because what was going on was the Chinese ambassador in London at the time, Liu Xiaoming, was pressuring members of parliament on this inquiry to withdraw their participation. And these members of parliament went to go on a trip to Hong Kong. And the Chinese flatly told them in 2014 that if they got on a plane and they went to Hong Kong, they would block them at the border and send them on the next plane back to London, which was quite extraordinary at the time. But I think it reflected even then that things were going wrong in Hong Kong, that democracy and human rights were under threat. And it really did pique my interest in China. I didn't work on China at that time, and I wouldn't come to work on China policy for many years. But I do point to that as quite a formative experience for me. I think the second story, or I suppose anecdote I would point out, is I left working for the Labour Party in 2019. I went abroad for a couple of months and I came home via Hong Kong in January 2020. So there was still some of these protests going on. It was just before COVID hit. And I was just struck even then by how much the city had changed. I mean, you'd only walk a couple of blocks, trying to get the tram to go up the mountains, and you'd be struck by these police garrisons wherever you went. Police officers with riot shields ready to essentially suppress protests. I went home. I ended up working for this NGO called Hong Kong Watch, based here in the UK. And 6 months later, you had the national security law imposed by Beijing on Hong Kong. And my organisation primarily campaigned for the UK government to honour its commitments to Hong Kongers that had the old British passport, to allow them and their families to move to the UK. And the government took up that scheme. It's been very successful. We now have about 200,000 Hong Kongers here in the UK with their families. And it really has, I think, changed a little bit the nature of Britain, but also, the nature of how we talk about China, because you have people who are political refugees because of the regime in China. You have people who have an experience, a footprint in the region. And actually led me to meeting my boss who started this organization, because he's a former pro-democracy lawmaker in exile now in the US. And his point was that you needed to have a think tank that thought about China through the lens of risk, because far too often when we have these conversations, it's binary, right? It's either, human rights first or it's business interests first. And that doesn't really reflect in our view where a lot of the conversation is in governments across Europe, with the Commission, with European businesses. It's often a risk calculus, right? What are the risks of engaging with China, what the risks of doing business, can we mitigate those risks? Also, what are the opportunities if there are opportunities? And so that's really why CSRI was founded. I was on the founding board, and why we do the work that we do.
This is all for now. I'll be back soon with more podcasts. You can always visit the website liberalforum.eu to know more about the activities of the European Liberal Forum.